Okay. So we won't be commencing soon. We are commencing immediately. Welcome everyone to this is the 4th ProductTank Reading. It was in September last year that we had the first one, which was the MVP. And this for me is probably another MVP in terms of, just how do we do these online ones. So we're giving it a try, we're giving it a go, seeing how that goes, what works, what doesn't work. So again, going to try and keep it fairly simple, I hope. I have to firstly just give out a big shout out for the Curious Lounge, because we're using their Zoom account anyway. So, just even though we're not in the Curious Lounge to meet up, they have allowed us to use that in order to keep the community going. So just a quick overview of the session. So after this opening, I'm going to hand over to Prerna, who will introduce you to our 2 panelists, which she will be interviewing and asking a few questions, and we'll have some discussion. We also have Jamie on the call. He is a recruiter from consortia who we have spoken to just before lockdown, who they've agreed to help us with sponsorship for future product tanks, and then lockdown kind of happened. But he is here, so if you want to kind of have a chat with him, he's not going to be partaking in the discussion, but I hope I'm not putting you on the spot, but you can send him some private messages, asking questions if you want. If you maybe want to get his contact details, I'm sure he'll be more than happy to share that. I don't know, maybe not. I think he is. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to shortly be just muting everyone. I think most people are muted anyway, but I'm going to just keep people muted for the just while we do the interviews. If you've got any questions that come up, feel free to type them into chat. There'll be kind of a Q&A for around 10 minutes or so towards the end, so towards 7, about 10 to 7. We'll open up for Q&A. So we'll either be reading questions from the chat, or just if you at that point want to unmute yourself, you will be able to just ask a live question. And then I think that's generally the housekeeping. Just try not to spam the chat too much. Just enjoy it. Enjoy hearing what our panelists have to say. On that, I'm going to hand over to Prerna, who will take over from here. I hope there's nothing that I've missed.
Cool. Thank you, Peter. Hello, everyone. I'm Prerna. I am very delighted to host our first virtual event. So welcome all. This is relatively new format for us, as Peter just mentioned. This is mainly about discussion with our panelists here, our guest here. But there we have few steering questions, but mainly it's about discussing and listening to their experiences and help us moving forward. Just before I start, I would just like to say that as an organizer, we are acutely aware of how we are overloaded with this virtual events, online meetups, discussions, and all that. So we want to make sure it's the best good use of your time. So our objective of this event is you leave here today with a feeling very thought-provoked, with some ideas and tips for making your work better, because each one of us have different challenges and we all want to grow in our work life. Last but not the least, your community is there to support you in this challenging time. We all are in it together, and we will go through this and we will thrive in this changing conditions. So on that note, I am going to welcome our amazing guest here, who's going to help us with some experiences, some tips which we can take away for our success. So Randy Silver, who is consultant, co-host of Product Experience podcast, and author of this amazing book, What Do We Do Now? And Louis Badcock, Product and UX Director at Kazoo, who is a startup just before the pandemic, but they are, I must say, they are thriving well in this time. So over to you, Randy. Maybe if you introduce yourself and your inspiration to write a book.
Sure. Thank you, Prerna. So I'm Randy Silver. You might know my voice if you listen to the podcast. You might not have ever met me, so hi. Um, let's see. I started writing the book because I was talking to a whole bunch of people now 2-3 months back, and a bunch of friends, a bunch of product leaders, and we were having similar types of conversations over and over, and the advice I was giving them and the conversations I was having seemed to fall into a pattern and really resonate. So I sat down to write an article to take that conversation from having it with a few people to a much larger group and see what the contributions from other people would be. And well, the article didn't stop. It just kept growing. And then I did an outline of the 10 points I want to make. And I said, ooh, each of these might be a chapter. And I just kept going. And then said, let me see if I can do something useful with this. And I pitched it to Jeff Gotthelf and Josh Seiden, who are brilliant people and run Sense and Respond Press. And they specialize in business books that are meant to be read in under an hour. So, most business books are like 400 pages with about 30 to 50 pages of useful stuff and then a lot of fluff. Somehow they figured out how to get rid of most of the fluff. And I figured if they liked what I was saying and would agree to do it all for charity, then we could do something really quick. So they agreed, and I wrote it in about a week and a half, and then we did some edits. And yeah, it's out now with all proceeds going to Doctors Without Borders, as I call it, but some American, and I think everyone else calls it Medicine Sans Frontier.
Amazing. Wow, wonderful. Thank you, Randy. Louis, would you like to introduce yourself, and maybe just to start the discussion, if you can share your experience as a product leader in a startup in difficult times, and what strategy you used, how you changed your approach to roadmap, which gives you this success.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Farina. Thanks for having me, and thanks to everyone who's shown up for this as well. To hear from us, I really appreciate you giving us your time. Hope it's a valuable use of it for you. I'm the product and UX director at Kazoo. For those of you who don't know Kazoo, we are a retailer of used cars, but we're exclusively online. Unlike sort of marketplaces like Auto Trader and CarWow and places like that, we actually own our own cars and we sell them. And the proposition is pretty simple. You can go online, you can choose from thousands of cars. We've got about 2,000 cars in stock at the moment. Browse the cars online. We point out all the sort of imperfections and issues with the car and give you like a full sort of history of it. And then pretty much like Amazon, except with cars, you can basically buy that car entirely online, select a 2-hour delivery slot. You can arrange finance for your car. You can do a part exchange, etc. We'll deliver it to your door, and then we sort of do a really nice handover process for our customers as well. We really take the time to walk the customers through sort of all the features of the car and point out the issues they hopefully saw on the site as well. And then to get around the fact that customers have never seen this car in real life before or driven it, we offer a 7-day money-back guarantee. So basically you can sort of drive it around for a week, and if you decide actually, do you know what, I just don't like the colour of it, or it's just not quite right for me, that's fine. We'll pick it up off you and give you a full refund. So it's quite a sort of a brand new concept, really. And yeah, we've been going since I joined the company just over a year ago, and we launched in December last year, just before Christmas, which is sort of a quiet time for used car sales generally. But we sort of launched without much sort of advertising fanfare, and pretty quickly actually found that there was a decent demand for this, which was very gratifying. It was a big gamble. And it was basically steadily building very nicely, and we started to roll out a load of TV adverts and press adverts in early 2020. And actually, interestingly, as soon as we turned on our television adverts and did our national advertising campaign, it really sort of changed the business overnight. It's sort of, in terms of visitors obviously sort of grew, but also conversion and sales just picked up massively. I think just by having sort of that sort of presence out there in the real world, people start to trust you a bit more as well. And so it was always going very well, and then obviously the pandemic kicked in, and we took a bit of a wobble, really. Things are now back on a much better path, actually. I just have to say, we've sort of returned to pre-pandemic sort of business levels and growing very nicely again, actually. But in that initial period, it was interesting. And so I guess to come to your question, really, it was a very interesting period, as I'm sure everyone on this this call has experienced, and that sort of actually everything you knew before was not the same, and there's just tons of uncertainty. And particularly for us, even though we're sort of obviously a digital first business, a large part of our organisation is actually in the physical world, because we own our own cars, we recondition cars, we deliver cars, and that whole operational side of our business was obviously very massively impacted by the start of lockdown, and so we had to actually pause doing deliveries for a period. We said we restart them in late April, but it was very interesting, because at the time of the lockdown, like sort of sales were really sort of kick off very nicely, and it wasn't really a question from a product perspective. It wasn't really a question of how we're going to be able to find sales and convince people to take the leap and buy this expensive item on a website. It was actually some of the challenges we were facing were actually in scaling the operation, like behind the scenes, the technology involved in actually fulfilling orders and doing deliveries and all that side of things. Before was beginning to creep. We were worried about it actually, because things were scaling so quickly, and we'd invested more effort in, as you typically do, in the sort of front end and the customer experience. And so we were quite concerned at the beginning, before this period, that was going to be a big issue. But of course, suddenly when sort of things sort of slowed down a bit, it was like, right, okay, we could breathe a bit now, and probably now is the time to start sort of fixing the roof while we can, while it's not raining, sort of thing. So it was interesting. So it did sort of subtly shift some of our priorities. I'll pause there.
Right. So, Randy, would you like to share something on this? Because I know in your book you touched about shifting priorities, and you had a few questions which we should ask before we shift priorities.
Sure. Well, it's quite a lot of questions, actually, but it starts with a basic assumption that everything that we do is based on a foundation of two things. And Louis, I'm curious to hear how you guys were affected by this. So it starts off with understanding who's your potential customer and what is the problem that they have. And then also understanding the state of the market, doing a basic market analysis, so you understand how you can compete with everyone else there. And when you do this, you put together a whole bunch of things and you set out your roadmap, and that's based on a series of facts and assumptions. And then you've got these hypotheses, which is a fact plus an assumption equals a hypothesis. So that's the bet. We think if we know this and we try this, this thing will happen. And we try and test those things as quickly as possible. We all know this. But the problem is, when something this fundamental happens, all the facts and the assumptions that you built your strategy on are now, well, they're a little bit screwed, potentially. Yeah. So the first thing you need to do, the first thing you need to do in a situation like this is make sure, is your team and everyone else all right, obviously. But the first thing you need to do from a product and strategy perspective is go back to the basics, go back to your personas, go back to your market analysis, and say, what's changed? What's changed in the market? What's changed our users? Are their priorities still the same? Are they still wanting to do this? Are their situation that they're in still the same? Are their capabilities still the same? And asking all of these fundamental questions. And that's, I'll stop there, because there's plenty more, but that's the starting point. Louis, how affected was your market analysis? I know that all the real world cars sales probably stopped. But what about your personas? Yeah, so it was a fascinating one. So we've been very broad from the beginning, actually. So we kind of haven't taken a necessarily very traditional persona approach at all, because we've kind of had ambitions from the beginning of being a broad national retailer of used cars. And the used car market, by the way, is absolutely massive. For those of you who don't know, it's around sort of 50 billion pounds in 2019 on the back of something like 8 million transactions. So it's huge. And it's also highly fragmented as well. So no car dealership in the UK has bigger than a 3% market share. Cars, as you know, obviously as well, kind of have quite a broad appeal, and there's a big old sort of group of customers who are interested in it. Our sort of initial sort of market analysis was that there was certainly a group who wouldn't be prepared to
purchase a car online. Typically, we suspected it'd be a slightly older demographic, and also people who are sort of more sort of concerned about really feeling and touching the car and sort of all the traditional aspects you'd expect. But we kind of identified that there was probably a sweet spot for us in terms of sort of kind of young professionals or sort of time poor people in sort of early stage families and stuff like that. And I guess the interesting thing about when the pandemic happened is, well, one, actually from a product point of view, which I think is really fascinating. One of the things I've sort of always gone about with my teams is, the reason why we do product discovery, i.e. we sort of want to build confidence that the thing we're building is actually going to answer a genuine customer need and actually deliver on that customer need. The reason we do discovery is because you can't predict the future. And I know that sounds obvious and trite, but nobody predicted this. And again, I don't wish to sort of overegg it because it is sort of a bloody obvious point, really. But I think it is also quite interesting reflecting on it, because it's such, it really brings that into sharp focus, because no one anticipated that our everyday lives would change in such a way, and therefore all the features and things that you might have been developing before, nobody would have ever, you wouldn't know whether they'd be successful or not. For us, it was an interesting situation though, because we kind of anticipated actually we should be in a good place for this market, right? Because all of the car dealerships across the UK had to close, and we don't have a showroom, and we're doing online delivery. And by the way, the likes of Ocado and all the supermarkets are doing very, very well. I know someone who works in a flowers business who said that they have two peaks a year, sort of one on sort of Valentine's Day, and I think another one is probably Mother's Day. Yeah, exactly. Where basically volumes go up to sort of 4 times the normal volume. Basically, this business saw volumes go up to 4 times the normal value and just sustain at that, and they were just suddenly flat out. Their business just kind of quadrupled in size overnight. So there's a lot of businesses doing very well at it. So you might assume that a business like Kazoo also absolutely perfectly suited for it. I think that the early days of the pandemic, all the metrics went totally crazy for us. So the numbers dropped in terms of traffic, because people were tuning into the very scary news that was happening on a daily basis. But that also had sort of weird effects of sort of boosting conversion and stuff like that, because we're in lower traffic base and you're still doing sales, you're getting sort of higher intent purchase, etc. And things like we measure the number of people who view our vehicle details page. That's a very important metric for us. Things like that went through the roof. It's like, great, you've done a great job. It's like, no, we haven't done anything. We haven't changed anything product wise. So it's the weird market conditions. But like I said, one of the things that really was obvious though was because actually making such a big purchase like a car online in such an uncertain market, obviously people are going to think twice for a bit. And we definitely sort of saw that initially. We also felt quite confident though that if we could, provided we could get the operation back up and running again and get delivery running again, there should be actually good demand for this because of the market closing generally with the car dealerships. And so we took steps to adapt our delivery process to make it a safe handover process, to properly sort of sanitize cars, etc. And we basically paused the delivery process to do that for a few weeks, and then sort of put up a lot of kind of messaging across the site as well to say, hey, we're actually still available, we're still open, but we're just not going to be delivering until late April. Changed our processes, and then we gradually started to ramp up again. And we're very fortunate that despite everything changing the way it has, our market is still actually very intact. And even with the economy and all the sort of issues around people's jobs and the inevitable recession that we're going to have, even if that shrinks the market for used cars by half, it's still a massive market. So, and we still feel like we've got plenty of room to grow in that.
You touched on a couple of really interesting things in there. Sorry, Prerna, do you mind if I ask you a question?
Please.
So you'd mentioned supermarkets, and it's an interesting one because I've talked to people from a couple of different chains, both in the US and the UK, and they were not ready for this. Obviously, no one was ready for this. But from the perspective of online orders, people were ready to expand maybe 2 to 3 times what their current capacity was. And they've all said their systems have held up remarkably well. What hasn't held up is exactly what you said, is the logistics side of it. So there were weeks there, and I actually haven't even gone and checked because my habits have changed now and I don't check anymore, whether there are any delivery slots open. So you'd think this would have been an incredible acquisition opportunity for supermarkets. And it turned out not to be, because they were barely able to deal with the customers they'd already acquired. So it became about retention and execution. And I know a number of other businesses had to shift their roadmaps on a dime, and suddenly acquisition wasn't potentially the problem, but activation, retention, support, churn, things like that became a real priority. So I'm curious, you might be too immature, that sounds rude, but your early stage in the company life cycle, did you have to radically shift the roadmap and say, okay, whatever our OKRs or priorities for this quarter are, we're now looking at something slightly different?
We shifted it, but it wasn't a radical shift like some companies have had to do. And I definitely know that supermarket thing rings true. And actually, if you try and get onto Ocado now, there's no website, there's just a login page. So unless you're a member of Ocado, you can't actually browse the site, I think. But yeah, for us, it was actually that point around scalability, because we kind of thought, right, okay, well, sales are probably not going to be sort of climbing at quite the rate they were before because of this, understandably. So actually, let's rather than sort of focusing so much on sort of initiatives to help that, let's double down on the sort of kind of more sort of back officey side style of things and the operational side of technology. So it did slightly shift that priority, and also interesting for us, for a startup with sort of mega ambitions. We want to, it's kind of the first year or so of what we're doing is very much about scale up as fast as we possibly can. Margin is important, but it's sort of not really the theme for the first year or so. It's actually let's scale as much as we can. Whereas margin has become a bit more of a focus for us now, because of, while we're actually, you'll see from the press, we're a very well funded startup. So we're very fortunate to have a decent war chest. Again, we need to be very careful with that, and so therefore some of those initiatives that are more sort of margin driving have become more higher priority than they were before. But again, I'd say I feel quite fortunate, because I know some businesses that have had to completely rip up their roadmaps and completely change and think, actually, what the hell, what are we going to do now? And for us, it was more of a sort of kind of a slight shift rather than a radical rebuild.
And it sounds like that's a terrible thing, having to rip up your roadmap. But the reality is, as product people, we should be really violently interrogating. Again, that sounds rude, but really looking at them from a hard perspective on a regular basis. Because if the underlying conditions have changed, then your roadmap makes no sense.
100%.
And I would just like to go back to what you mentioned earlier, Randy, about persona. I start with the personas first. And in your book, you very nicely articulated examining persona needs. And I've actually personally read that chapter twice and asking those right questions. But there's one thing very interesting you mentioned there, that if you do not know the answers, go back to basics and do your discovery. So this is my next question is around remote discovery. How do we ensure remote discovery is a success and we make that customer and user contact in this time?
I hate to give you the most product answer possible, and if you have a drink in front of you, I think this is the time to drink it. I'm going to say it depends. So sorry, I had to get that out of the way. So there's a number of different ways. So for a number of people I've talked to, strangely enough, their customers are actually more available than ever before, because people are a little bit lonely. So some people have been furloughed and things like that. Now, obviously, if your customer is working as a key worker, they have less time and you do not want to bother them. But there are a lot of people who actually have a little bit more time and want the contact or want to have a discussion about something that they wouldn't normally be having. But there are a number of different things you can do. So there are things like diary studies that you can absolutely do that is a really translatable thing. You can get people to take you on a tour of their kitchen, of their home, of their working environment and things like that, and get them to show you exactly what they're doing using their camera or screen recording and things like that you wouldn't necessarily do. Again, you can talk to people. There's a technique I work with a company out in New York called Motivate Design that does something really interesting. And the basic idea for us is one of the phrases we say all the time is, when's the last time you as a product manager talked to your customer? And that's not really the right question. Because talking to your customer could be marketing, it could be advertising. What we really want to get out of that is, what's the last time you listened to your customer? And that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be the one who's having the conversation with them. So diary studies is one good way of having a customer tell you things. Another one is getting a conversation to happen between between two potential customers, an existing customer and another customer, between someone you know and who has access to the customer, because they will talk to people that they already have a relationship with in a way that they won't talk to you. So we just try and do all these things about removing bias and not asking leading questions and things like that. But if you're talking to your friend, biased questions are fine, leading questions are fine, because they're going to generate these amazing conversations. And I know when we've recorded these calls and we get the transcripts back, if I see people cursing in them, I know it's really great, because they've let their guard down and they're being really, really brutally honest about what they think.
Yeah, that's good. Cool. Do you have anything to add on this, Louis?
Yeah, I mean, fully agree with Randy, actually. And from our perspective, I mean, the most obvious impact for us has been not conducting laboratory user research. So having customers, actually we've got a lab in our offices, and having customers come in and do user research with them face to face. Obviously, we're not doing that anymore. But aside from that, while it's definitely got its challenges, we've managed all right. So we use remote user testing platforms like usability.com, etc., to still run sort of quick qual tests. We also, to Randy's point as well, customers are, if anything, customers are a bit more around than they were before, so it's slightly easier to recruit. And we do, in terms of, like, we have a contact center. I'm sure a lot of people on this call have still, contact centers, and so we've still got access, obviously, to all those calls, etc. So from a customer point of view, it hasn't been too bad. If anything, it's been a bit more challenging for us from a sort of internal point of view. So some of our sort of internally facing product teams who work with our operations teams. So for example, we have, there's a group of people, we've got a facility in Corby where we basically store all our cars, and that's where we do all our reconditioning of the cars, and we photograph them, etc. And then we're building technology for those teams to basically make that process super efficient and basically get cars onto the site as accurately described as possible, as quickly as possible. And we were just, as this all happened, we've just been sort of launching a new internal app for those teams to use. And actually, before, we would go up to Corby and we'd be with the teams, we'd observe them, and we'd trail them and walk around with them. And suddenly now, when we're kicking off something new, obviously we can't do that because there's all the restrictions. So that has made it more challenging. Having said that, though, there are ways. There's plenty of sort of simple. You just have to think of some pragmatic ways around it. So, for example, we've had some of the staff in Corby who are there do sort of video, kind of what other people are doing for us, and we still interview them. We can still try out prototypes and things with them. So it's still possible. And so I wouldn't, I certainly wouldn't let this situation be an excuse not to do any sort of customer validation regardless of who your customer is.
Yeah, good. And there's another point, question to both of you actually, around metrics, product metrics and KPI. We talked about roadmap, and mostly what we all are doing, we are making evidence-based roadmap on, based on the data we have. And now when everything is changing, right, Randy, when you're saying that roadmaps are changing because no one predicted that. So what's the role of metrics here? Are you gonna change your metrics? You're gonna, if you're making reactive decisions, you're gonna, observe them, measure them. What is the role around metrics here?
I don't know that there is a rule. I mean, metrics at any time have to work for you. If you make the metrics the thing that you're working for, then you're kind of doing it wrong. So I'm not sure that there's really, from a philosophical standpoint, that there's any difference in this situation around metrics. I don't know, Louis, has anything changed for you guys?
No, I mean, I agree with you, Randy, totally, because I think, again, I think if you're having to change your metrics, then it suggests your metrics weren't correct in the first place, because surely what's important for your business are these metrics, and they're actually actual metrics. The thing I would say is that as I kind of alluded to this before, with such a dramatic world change, and again, this is extreme because again, on a day, if we weren't in this situation on a day-to-day basis, all sorts of other things like the weather, for example, or I don't know if there's something major happening on TV or something, all these things can obviously affect your metrics. But what has happened with this extreme situation is they've certainly gone all quite fuzzy and skew-if, and so it's harder to get a good read from them. Particularly, like I said, like conversion, which is such a sort of volatile metric. And I could claim that conversion was brilliant for a while, but that was only because traffic was a bit lower, sort of thing. So it's not really very fair. But what I would say is the interesting thing, particularly in working in a startup, as I'm sure sort of many people on this call would relate to, is we all talk in products about, of course we want to be as data sort of focused as possible and use the metrics all the time. But there's the other side of metrics is they can be quite misleading. They can be, the precision, the number feels like it's quite a precise thing, but actually, is it really? And what does it really tell you? I mean, you only have to look at the daily statistics that the government give out on coronavirus, and you see that it changes as and when things get added in, like something small test. Suddenly we're adding care homes, by the way. So it all suddenly changes. So I always kind of try and counsel my product teams to say that data is always imperfect. And again, sorry if this is a cliche, it is always imperfect. You've got to make do with the data you've got, and then you're going to have to make a bit of a judgment call at the end of the day. Don't sort of take sort of refuge that the numbers are going to tell us. I'm sorry, you need to use the numbers to make an informed decision, and we've had to do a fair bit of that. And it's like we're releasing like there's quite a few things that we've been sort of adding to our customer experience. So for example, MOT, the last MOT for the car had, and it turns out that's quite an important thing for customers. It's really hard for us to measure the impact of that. How the hell do you measure the impact of that? Well, we've got a sort of rough sort of rule of thumb actually that we feel like some of our contact might have gone down for asking about MOTs, but the way we measure and classify and categorize our contacts at the moment is still quite early days because we're a startup. So again, sometimes you just have to sort of make do with the best that you've got.
Yeah, good. Thank you. I'm just conscious of the time, and I'm moving towards my last topic here, and this is one of the most popular among our members. When I ask them if they have any particular question, it's about ways of working. Now I know ways of working could be various things, right? It could be tools, processes, and various other things. But my question is mainly around, we all are in different situations, right? We all have different level of stress and different situations, juggling between home and work. Some employers are very cooperative, but some are not. But we all are expected to deliver same productivity levels. Now, productivity could be defined in various ways. So what's your take on that? Maybe, Randy, if you can start with your insights. That you work with so many teams.
Yeah, I haven't seen exactly what you're saying, and I'm curious to dig into yours a little bit. Generally, at least earlier on, people were being very, very understanding about impact on productivity, and availability was a big thing. You may be around, but what else do you have to take care of at home? Are you looking after a child? Do you have a partner? Or is somebody sick? All of these things really impact. And even if you live alone or you don't have kids yet, and everyone's fine, just the situation that you're in. I mean, mentally, people were really feeling it. You're in unideal working conditions. You might be working from the couch or the table or something that's physically uncomfortable. Your Wi-Fi might not be so good. The capabilities of what tools do you have available to you? I've worked in some big corporates in the past, and usually it was the finance and HR systems that were the ones that were on-prem and really, really didn't work very well off-site. But there's any number of things from just having physical things in the office, the ability to turn and talk to someone for 2 or 3 seconds, the chatting to someone over coffee, matching for serendipity, and all of those things. It's totally different. And then you're sitting there and you're potentially on calls like this for 7 hours a day. it's exhausting. So ways of working absolutely have to change, and I've seen a lot of companies have changed them. Companies that were remote ahead of time before this have noticed a few things from them. So just a couple of things. One is the idea of presenteeism absolutely does not work in this world, where you're just expecting someone to be sitting at their desk and doing productivity theater and sitting in, you don't know what they're actually typing, but as long as they look like they're working. So managers who can deal with outcomes rather than outputs, and rather than just being at the desk, that was always a superpower, but now it's absolutely essential. Another one from that was some companies have changed the way that they deal with their benefits, and they have started advancing money to people so that they can upgrade their Wi-Fi or get a second monitor or get a desk or a chair or things like that, and that's been really key. Other ones I've seen do things like a weekly Deliveroo allowance, and everyone has a pizza and they have a lunch together once a week, or things like that, so that they have social. I've also seen teams do Dungeons and Dragons or game nights and social drinks and all kinds of things.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, and the last one is that I noticed from companies that were working well in a distributed way ahead of time. They had a real distinction between social channels and the common channels they used and urgent channels. So even in Slack, they would or something like that, they would have a special channel that was kept relatively free, and because if you put everything into one channel, you just lose it over time, and you just don't pay the same amount of attention to it. So having something there that's more for social and conversational and incidental, but having something else that says, this is important, this actually really needs attention, it needs an answer quickly. And if you notice that there's something else in there, you definitely check it. Whereas the other one, sometimes you just mute, or you just say, I'm too tired to deal with that channel today.
Yeah, that's good. Louis?
Yeah, I'd again echo much of what Randy says, and I think, yeah, I mean, I'd say to everyone on this call, assuming we're all product people, and before this, we all sort of had very busy days and meetings anyway. So if anything, this has just exacerbated it because of that removal of those sort of impromptu, sort of quick, sort of cool water cooler side chats, etc., that you could have otherwise. So I think for product people in particular to do your job well, this definitely makes it tougher, just because of the sheer wall-to-wall Zoom meetings and context switching that places on you. So I really feel for everyone on this call. Some of the things we've done at Kazoo to sort of try to ease sort of this new way of working, we have, despite me just saying meetings, overload meetings, we really have tried to over-index on some of the sort of like ask me anything style meetings. So particularly at the beginning when we sort of suddenly switched to remote working, and by the way, actually unusually perhaps, Kazoo, we weren't really sort of doing much remote working. We were doing it a little bit ad hoc at the beginning, but because we're a new startup, one of the benefits of us being together in an expensive office in London is that we are together and we can move faster because of it. So we didn't do much remote working before. So it was a very sudden and dramatic change for us. And so one of the things we did was we did a lot of Ask Me Anything meetings where there wouldn't be much of an agenda apart from maybe an update on what the latest sort of business impacts or whatever's were, but then we'd encourage people just to literally ask anything. There are no stupid questions, and we did that quite regularly, and it got a lot of positive feedback from people. So I'd encourage any leaders here on this call to do the same with their teams. Other things we did was in Slack, sort of some things that Rand just mentioned, that we have a working from home channel. And all it, like literally people just say good morning on it in the morning. It's really nice to just start the morning, just good morning, all sort of thing. But it's quite nice. And sort of similarly as well, we've got a few sort of, there's like a permanent Google Hangout channel which is called The Kitchen, and it's like if anyone wants to drop in at any time and just have a chat, if they're having a coffee sort of thing, it's supposed to be a sort of informal way to try and encourage having those sort of kind of those serendipitous conversations that you would have otherwise in the office. Nice. And then the last point I make is, I'm sure everyone's already doing this, but wow, Miro really actually has come into its own. Miro is something we used a fair bit of before, but I'm deeply skeptical about whiteboarding sessions and user story mapping, event storming, stuff like that remotely. And actually, we've done a few of these. We've kicked off a couple of really major projects remotely, actually, and it's been brilliant. It's been like not just for your stickies and that sort of aspect of things, but actually also for presentations. You can set up a whiteboard in advance, and you can sort of talk people along it. You can see where people are and stuff. And it's, I mean, honestly, I'm not being paid by them to say this, but I would thoroughly recommend using it as a great product collaborative tool.
Cool.
Yeah, they're absolutely crushing it.
Yeah.
Sorry, just to respond to a couple of things you said there. So in terms of meetings, one thing that I've encouraged a couple people to do and that they've responded well to is take on the Marie Kondo approach to your diary. To look at the meetings and say, is this adding value? And if not, see, can you change this to an asynchronous update, or can you do it less often and just reclaim any, because a lot of the meetings that we have standing in our diary are things that have been there for months or years, and just it's a good time to re-examine. Along with the kitchen channel, if you use Slack, there are apps like plugins like Donut and Shuffle that do a good job of setting up random coffees and random meetings, and I'm in a few groups where we do that on a regular basis, and it's great to just have a chat with someone you didn't have on your agenda. Just for half an hour every once in a while. And the last one is one of the really key things, something that's hard to do in the office at the best of times, is to make sure that everyone is fully aligned in terms of what the strategy is. So the real test now is, can you explain it to a 6-year-old? And if you happen to have a handy 6-year-old around, it's a really good thing. But if you can do that, then you know that everyone, and clearly also get them to be able to explain it back to you. That's a really good test of making sure that the teams are aligned, because it is so hard. Everyone gets very, very siloed. You don't have the ambient things of seeing other people's roadmaps and things up on the walls. Just all that is gone in this world. So people get siloed in their own channels. So to make sure that you bring people back together at certain points and they all understand what is it that you're actually trying to do.
Yeah, that's really good ones. Very good ones. My last question was to conclude one thing which we can start tomorrow. Well, you guys have given so many things. So, but still, I would still ask us one thing which we can actually start doing tomorrow.
Oh, you've thrown me there.
So I've been actually asking people for the last couple of weeks what's one thing that they've learned during lockdown, which is a slightly different take on it. So I'm going to share the what I've been thinking about from that perspective while I stall for time to think about the answer to your question. And it's really more of a reaction to everything that's going on in the world right now. There's lockdown, and then there's everything. I'm American, so I've been watching what's happened in the States and seeing how it's impacted over here as well. And I like to think of myself as someone who's been supportive and an ally of my entire life. But the thing that I've really learned over the last week is that whatever I'm doing, that's nice, but you have to also be active. It's not enough to just be passively supportive. And to say that I was in a meeting where we asked to talk about one thing that we'd done recently that we were proud of. And there were things I could talk about, but generally the feeling that I had was, whatever it was I've done, it's not enough. And that's not a bad thing, because from a product perspective, it means I should be iterating and continuing to do more. So that's the self-examination side of it. I don't know. I don't know if I have one specific thing to do tomorrow that'll make your life instantly better. Buy the book. Donate to charity by buying the book. That's a good one.
Yeah. Read What Do We Do Now? Yeah. Louis.
Okay. Well, you put me on the spot. I'm gonna say. I don't think this is particularly insightful or great, so please don't shoot me down for it. But I think sort of building on Randy's previous comments about diaries is mark out some time in a diary tomorrow, mark out an hour, 2 hours, and ask yourself, what are you doing? Are you doing the most valuable possible thing for your product at the moment? And if you're not, what are you going to do to change it? Because again, on this meetings point, it's so easy to, you're slammed in all these meetings all day, you're dealing with your stakeholders, that's all great. But actually, what are you doing? The hard work is actually the thinking through of actually, are you doing the right things, and how do you know you're doing the right things? So sit down tomorrow, think about, am I doing the most important things? Think about, am I addressing the four risks of discovery? And if you're not, what are you going to do to change it?
Great, good. So basically just reflect, yeah?
Basically, yeah. So yeah,
Thank you.
much better than my ramble.
Thank you so much. It was great to talk to you both. So I will hand over to Peter on this.
Okay, well, we have two questions in the chat, so we will quickly just I will just quickly read that. So Alan's question is, I'm wondering if XR COVID, BLM, should I know those three-letter acronyms? Are
Extinction Rebellion, COVID, Black Lives Matter.
Thank you. Are prompting more thoughts on social responsibility, sustainable development metrics for your product strategy?
I'm a consultant, so my product strategy is just to continue working and helping everyone else get better at what they do. So not directly on me, but what I think the only thing I can answer on that is you can see the effects from Extinction Rebellion and sustainability perspective. You can see the effects on greenhouse gas emissions and usability of things and how the world has changed and how some habits have changed. And I'd say not necessarily into sustainable development metrics necessarily, but in terms of product strategy and trying to rethink where you want to go and what good looks like. It definitely is something that should be factored in. And one way of looking at that is doing some scenario planning and saying, if the world goes in this direction, if depending how some elections go, depending on some legislation, depending on how some social movements go, are you prepared to be in the right place? And you can make some projections about what's going to happen to some of the underlying economics for you based on will there be government subsidies or taxes on fossil fuels and things like that, and will things change? So are you prepared for all of those things? And yeah, I do love that. Yeah, never waste a good crisis is a fantastic way of looking at that.
Louis, any comments from you on there?
Yeah, I mean, I would say we kind of obviously, being we're part of the car industry, so so that's an interesting angle for us. But I guess one of the things that we've got a keen eye on is electric vehicles, and actually we've got a pretty decent sort of volume of electric vehicles on our site actually, and they sell very well actually. So it's kind of we've got an eye on that. Basically, we will go wherever customers take us. Really, we want to make sure that obviously we don't live in a bubble. We live and breathe and work in the UK like everyone else. So we're very much aligned with sort of the direction of the used car market in that respect, and actually we do a number of things to sort of highlight sort of kind of emissions and stuff like that from all the vehicles that we sell. But more broadly as well, we do recognise the part we play in society, and I mean, we do our fair share of sort of charity action, and we did a lockdown challenge of we had basically everyone, we had a challenge of trying to get to sort of 10,000 miles exercise, walked, sort of biked or swam or whatever over a short period of time, which our founder Alex Chessman then gave. I think it was something like I can't remember how much he gave, but it was a very decent sum of money to the NHS. So we are, we're acutely aware of it. I would say it's well, it doesn't sort of hasn't directly changed our product strategy. Of course, we work with people, we sell to people. It really does matter for us. It does figure in our thinking. Yep.
And then the next question from Margot: what do you think an effective quarterly planning looks like? I don't know which one.
I keep going first, Louis. It's your turn.
Okay. Thank you. Sorry, what do you think an effective quarterly plan looks like? I think, yes, it's a good one. I think they're very hard to do, to be honest. And I'm not sure whether we've necessarily nailed it, but what we are, the sort of cycle we follow is we set company-wide, we have a kind of a sort of set of OKRs of actually what's important for the company for this quarter, and then it's done sort of at each department level. There's sort of 4 or 5 broad departments. Product engineering, we are actually, so by the way, yeah, we're set up, we're not, some companies have products and technology separate. We are one team at Kazoo, and so we have our set of OKRs. And what we do is we kind of based on what's important for the company, we then, each of the product teams, they all have areas of responsibility that they look after. They all have missions. We've tried to set up the product teams in the way that we think is best, sort of according to empowered product teams who are there given areas of opportunities or problems to solve, and are free to sort of work out actually what's the right way to solve those things. Those teams with their sort of areas of responsibility and knowing what the company objectives are for the quarter are then basically there to propose actually, well, what are our OKRs for this quarter? And there's a bit of we have a bit of a negotiation with them and stakeholders and with us actually in leadership, and then hopefully we sort of end up agreeing on a great set of these would be great results to see if we got to the end of the quarter. Now let's go and do it, sort of thing. That's the model we're trying to land. And to be honest, to be really sort of frank with you, all, sort of like some teams this works really, really well. Some of the product teams are a bit more sort of mature and are in a space where it's a bit more open-ended and can do this. Other product teams struggle a bit more with this one because we're still in startup mode. And actually, when you start a business up as well, there's a lot of sort of basic, sort of just obvious things that you need to do and get out of the door. It doesn't need a great amount of discovery. You just need to get on with it and do it. Like, for example, the ability to take payments, stuff like that. So it does vary by team, but that's sort of how we approach it.
I'm going to take the outcomes over outputs approach on that one. So it shouldn't be any different now than it is at any other time. Does everyone understand what they need to be working on to help the company? And conversely, do they understand what's not important to be working on? And that's at the product team level and at the executive level. And it's not all about everyone aligning and agreeing. It's you can disagree and commit, but it's making sure that there is a plan that everyone is signed up to and that you're clear on it. And that if things are going to change, that you'll proactively communicate about it. There's a woman named Lucy McLean who did this amazing talk a couple of years ago up at Mind a Product in Manchester. And we've also had her on the podcast talking about using portfolio investment theory. The idea being that in a mature company, like 70% of what you do is about keep the lights on and 10% incremental improvements at best. And then there's a certain amount that's like 20% and 10% of increasingly high risk that you don't need to guarantee a reward on, and being very conscious of you will have so many projects and initiatives and time spent on the keep the lights on incremental, and then a certain amount of time spent on things that you expect to fail, but you only need some of them to hit, but they will be potential game changers. And just being really clear as to what's in what bucket, and that everyone knows what they need to do and not do.
Right. Here's another one. Isn't it too soon to do or to redo discovery or replan product strategy? We're still in an uncertain state of things. On my point of view, we won't get a good view of the new reality before things move, go more back to normal. And that's a question from Leonardo.
I'll jump in first for this one, maybe, Randy, if you don't mind. So I would say no, absolutely not. It is not too soon. I mean, you're living in the reality already. It's here, and again, to the point of discovery, you can't predict the future, and we don't know how long it's going to take to go back to normal, as you put it in quotes. It might be sort of 6 months, it might be a couple of years, it might be never. It might be the world will be changed forever in some shape or form right from this. So it's definitely not too soon. And actually, that's really this is where we as product people should really be in our element, because rather than rigidly following a plan of what was before, we should actually be responding in a very agile way to market conditions and thinking actually what is now the best way to drive value for our organization here and today, rather than again, if you've got some problem with the sort of your far off vision, if you're in a business that's really been if you're an airline or something like that, and that's a very different place to be. But if you're in a business that's still viable, I'd say just you need to rethink now and don't waste a second about it.
Yeah, how do you know what normal is? How do you know what disruption is going to come next? It may not be a global pandemic. It might not be something this universal, but it might be something as simple as a competitor releasing a market-changing feature, or a merger or a bankruptcy somewhere and creating a massive opportunity or a massive disruption for you. So there's no such thing as normal. You need to be doing scenario planning and having general ideas on this kind of stuff on a very regular basis. This is your job within the company more than anyone else's. Probably more so as you get a little more senior in product, but you spend a little less time on tactical, a little bit more on strategy. But it is something that's incredibly important for you to always be thinking about.
Yep. I've got I think there's 2 more questions. So the next one, Amrik, what is the role of leadership specifically during these times of heightened personal and professional anxiety? Anyone want to take that?
Yeah, absolutely critical, I think. I think kind of to actually, and I totally echo Nigel's comment underneath that as well about checking with your team and how they are. It was so unsettling, particularly at the beginning, I think, when everything was changing and you had all these sort of big, terrible news stories on a daily basis, and and also people's, the reality of people's lives, actually, people being ill from this virus and people's families, etc. So I think kind of from a leadership point of view, sort of telling people that it's okay to be kind of worried and concerned at this stage. It's completely normal. And to also to really make the space for people and say, if you want to chat, if you want to reach out, so you're going out of your way to check in with people. And I think also this point as well around our working lives as well. Like, how am I going to suddenly, my kids are home all the time? What am I going to do? It's going to be a real struggle for me to work. And I've had a couple of new starters during this period, so they've never actually been into the office, which is, that's really, really challenging for them. And I've sort of had to say to them, it's fine. If you've got kids and stuff, and do what you need to do. We're all working slightly differently. Fundamentally, you've got to trust your people and make sure that they feel really, really assured and that they've got all the chance to reach out. But it is hard, and I would say also that you've got to keep an eye out as well, because some people won't be comfortable about reaching out to you, and some people will sort of retreat a bit. So
yeah, I agree 100%. It's different and it's heightened now, but it's no different than it always is, in that making sure that your team is, and the people around you are taken care of first, mentally and physically and psychologically, which is the same as mentally. But making sure that everyone's taken care of, that the expectations set on them are realistic, and that there's a sense of clarity about what they are trying to do and not trying to do, and how it's all going to align. I think it's always important to check in on people and make sure that they're able to bring their whole self to work, and that they're not dealing with anything untoward in terms of stress. But it is obviously much more so right now than usual.
Thank you. And then last question, and I know we slightly over time, and then I can have this glass. I actually have a glass of wine sitting in front of me, so then I can have that. So Margot, thank you for taking us into overtime. How much time do you think a PO or PM needs to spend on planning upcoming priorities for their product? And I'll leave it open for you guys to fight who's going to answer it.
Do you want me to go first on that one?
Go for it, Randy. Yeah.
Again, it's an it depends answer, and it's mostly dependent on where your product is in its cycle and where you are within the team and what the team looks like. I did a conversation with John Cutler a while back, who's an absolute genius on this stuff, and he basically said, if you're not spending an hour a day just thinking and looking at possibilities, then you're probably not doing the right job as a product person. But it really depends. There's I don't know if you're familiar with the bathtub cycle of something being newly introduced to market, being reasonably mature, or going on the curve towards obsolescence. And if you are early on, you need to really be thinking about strategy. If you're in a reasonably mature space and you're just optimizing, maybe not quite so much. And then again, as you're going towards obsolescence, then you need to really be thinking on grow, pivot, kill, and what you're going to do to revitalize. So it's, what does your team need right now? What are the requirements for the product will dictate how you spend your time.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. Randy, and I'd agree wholeheartedly on that life cycle of your product thing, because some of my teams have just embarked on brand new products, and that's been difficult because setting the strategy and the priorities at the beginning when you've got that open-end discovery, what is the right thing to do first, really, really hard, versus something that's a bit more mature where you can sort of see opportunities and you probably go at it a bit faster. But what I would challenge you to sort of think to everyone, to yourselves is, just thinking about my priorities, do they stack up? And actually also, if I think about everyone across my business as well, all of my stakeholders, would they understand why we're working in this order? They might not necessarily agree with it, and that's fine. It's not a consensus thing, but would they understand and basically agree to disagree or whatever, and commit to your priority order? Or if you're not so sure about that, then I think you should probably be thinking about, actually, well, how do I spend some more time on this, and how do I actually make sure that people see the transparency around this and are bought into the order which we're doing things in.
Awesome. So I think the only other thing, Nigel posted a comment in the chat, and I think it's just really, really important that it's just, and he said, just he starts conversations with his team about, just asking them how they are, and I think that's probably just important just for everyone right now, right? It's just checking that people are okay. So that is it. We have come to the end. I hope that the format was okay. I'll probably send out a survey tomorrow or so, just to kind of check if you've got any comments, if you've got any feedback, let me know. Just really want to say thank you to Nigel, Prerna, Louis, Randy. Thank you so much for organizing, for taking part. Thank you for Jamie for making yourself available in private messages. It has been great. And I do have a glass of wine waiting, so thank you, everyone.
Do you have one for me?
Cheers. Well, if we were in the real Curious Lounge, then maybe. But yes, thank you, everyone. I don't know if anyone wanted to stay or if anyone wanted to have a chat. I think the time's a little bit over. So yeah, thank you.
Cheers. Have a great night.